The engineers came prepared for everything: tablets, drones, pressure charts, hydraulic models, and a crane big enough to lift a school bus. By noon, they were confident. By 3, they were worried. By dusk, fear had finally reached their faces. The floodgate protecting Benton Ridge was locked shut during the worst rain that Missouri Rivertown had seen in 30 years. Brown water slammed against the steel panels like something alive, rising heavier by the minute, while every modern override failed in front of them. Then 6-year old Arthur Briggs stepped out of the crowd in his worn canvas coat and said quietly, "You're trying to open the wrong gate." A few people laughed. They laughed because Arthur had worked in the old river mill before most of them were even born. They laughed because they only saw an old man talking about a forgotten system the town had buried under concrete in 1974. His son grabbed his sleeve and whispered, "Dad, please, you're embarrassing yourself." But Arthur kept staring at the abandoned brick mill. Because if he was right, Benton Ridge still had a chance. And if he was right, his father had died warning them for nothing. If you have ever seen an old man dismissed because his knowledge came from calloused hands instead of a college degree, stay with this story until the end. This is not only about a floodgate, it is about a father, a son, a buried warning, and a town that only listened to the truth when the water was already at its door. By late afternoon, Benton Ridge no longer sounded like a town. It sounded like a place holding its breath. Rain beat the roofs in hard silver sheets. Brown water ran along Main Street, dragging leaves, gravel, and torn church flyers through the gutters. On the lower side of town, families were already loading pickup trucks with photo albums, medicine bottles, sleeping children, and anything else they could carry before the river reached their porches. For 30 years, Benton Ridge had trusted the floodgate. The county had called it modern. The brochures had called it reinforced, computer-monitored, sensor-guided, and emergency-ready. People had believed those words because believing them was easier than fearing the Missouri River every spring. But now the river was rising, and the gate would not open. At the control station, 3 engineers stood under a temporary canopy while their tablets glowed blue against the rain. Ethan Cole, the lead engineer from Street, Louis, wiped water from his screen with his sleeve again and again. He had arrived calm. Now his jaw was locked tight. "We tried the remote release," one engineer said. "Try it again." "We did, twice." They had checked the hydraulic pump, the relay signal, the actuator, the pressure sensors, the backup panel, and the manual override built into the modern housing. Behind them, a crane sat on the access road with its boom raised, huge and useless. Every test gave the same answer. The floodgate did not move. Mayor Helen Carver came fast through the rain in a yellow raincoat over a navy suit, moving from the police chief to the engineers to the volunteers stacking sandbags near the barricades. "How long before it opens?" she asked. No one answered. On the hill above the river, townspeople stood in the rain. Some had homes below the waterline. Some had elderly parents they could not move quickly. Others had come simply because fear pulls people toward the thing that may destroy them. Near the back stood Arthur Briggs. He was 76, wearing a worn canvas coat darkened by rain, gray hair flattened to his forehead, one hand resting on a wooden cane. Most people in Benton Ridge knew him as the old mill worker, who still sorted bolts in coffee cans and talked too much about the years when the river mill still ran. Arthur watched the engineers for a long time. He did not study their tablets. He studied their hands, their eyes, and the places they were not looking. Then his gaze moved to the abandoned brick mill beside the river, its broken windows black in the storm. "You're trying to open the wrong gate," he said. The words were quiet. Still, enough people heard them. A few heads turned. Someone laughed once, short and sharp. Ethan looked over, irritated and exhausted. "I'm sorry," he said. Arthur lifted his cane toward the steel structure. "That's the panel. That's not the whole gate." One engineer let out a hard breath. "Sir, we know what the gate is." "No," Arthur said. "You know what they left you on paper." The crowd shifted. Mayor Carver stepped closer. "Arthur, this is not the time." "It's exactly the time." He pointed toward the old mill. "There's a lower linkage beneath that building. Runs through the old wheel chamber and into the gate frame. If pressure has jammed the hydraulic lock, you won't free it from up here." Ethan's face tightened. "There is no lower linkage on the current plans." Arthur nodded. "That's because the current plans don't go back far enough." Before Ethan could answer, Mark Briggs pushed through the crowd. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, wearing a contractor's jacket and the expression of a man watching his reputation drown in public. "Dad," Mark said, "come on." Arthur did not move. Mark lowered his voice. "These people are trying to save the town. Don't turn this into one of your old mill stories." "So am I." "No, you're embarrassing yourself." Arthur looked down at his son's hand, gripping his sleeve. For a moment, the rain seemed louder than the sirens. Then Arthur looked back at the mill. He remembered another hand there, once his father's hand, scarred and strong, guiding his 16-year-old palm onto cold iron. Feel the wheel before you force it, son. The memory hit so hard Arthur had to lean on his cane. Behind him, the river slammed the locked gate with a deep metallic groan. Ethan's tablet flashed another warning. Mayor Carver asked again if the engineers could open it. Arthur heard the silence that followed. That silence meant no. He stepped away from Mark. If that gate stays shut, Arthur said, the lower streets are gone before midnight. Mark's face hardened. You don't know that. Arthur looked at the rising water. Yes, I do. Then he started walking toward the abandoned mill. People called after him. Someone mentioned liability. Mayor Carver shouted his name. Mark cursed under his breath. Arthur did not stop. Because he was not walking toward an old building, he was walking toward the last room where he had seen his father alive. Arthur had not stepped inside Briggs' mill for almost 20 years. Even before the county chained the doors, he had avoided it. He told people it was because the floors were rotten, because the roof leaked, because a man his age had no business walking through a building that had been falling apart since the Carter administration. Those reasons were true enough to be useful. But they were not the real reason. The real reason was that every brick in that place remembered his father. When Arthur was 16, the mill was still alive. Not pretty, not clean, not safe as a player, to safe by modern standards, but alive. It shook before sunrise when the first belt started moving. The windows glowed yellow in winter darkness. Steam rose from vents along the wall. The floor smelled of oil, wet rope, river mud, sawdust, and hot metal. Men spoke loudly because the machines were louder, but Arthur's father, Samuel Briggs, rarely raised his voice. Samuel did not teach by explaining everything at once. He taught by making Arthur pay attention. Don't just look at a machine, Samuel used to say. Listen to what it's trying to tell you. Arthur hated that sentence at first. He wanted clear instructions. Pull this lever, tighten that bolt, stay away from that shaft. But Samuel made him stand still beside the old gear housings until he could tell the difference between a healthy rhythm and a bad one. He made him put his palm near a bearing cap, close enough to feel heat but not close enough to be foolish. He made him learn that machines failed long before they broke, if a man was humble enough to notice. The most important lesson was under the mill. Samuel took Arthur there on a cold morning in 1966, when frost still clung to the river grass and the town above them was barely awake. They went through a narrow service door behind the old turbine room, down iron steps slick with condensation, and into a lower chamber Arthur had only heard about from older workers. At the far wall was the wheel. It was black iron, shoulder-high, with spokes thick as axe handles and a faded plate bolted above it. 1911. Arthur remembered touching it for the first time. The metal was cold enough to sting. This is not decoration, Samuel said. Arthur tried to turn it, but it did not move. His father stopped him before he put his weight into it. Feel the wheel before you force it, son. Samuel placed both hands on the rim and leaned slowly, not with panic, not with pride, but with patience. Somewhere beyond the wall, deep inside the gate frame, something answered with a dull mechanical click. That wheel talks to the river gate, Samuel said. If the top system jams, this gives men one more chance. Arthur looked at the iron linkage running into the darkness. Why don't they use it? Because most days they don't need it. Samuel wiped grease from the plate with his thumb. But a town doesn't build safety for most days. It builds safety for the worst one. Arthur did not understand the weight of that sentence then. He only understood that his father's hands looked certain on the wheel, and that made the chamber feel less frightening. Samuel was not an easy man, but he was a steady one. He did not say, I love you often. He said, check your footing. He said, keep your gloves dry. He said, eat before the shift, not after. He showed affection through warnings, because in the mill, warnings kept men alive. By the early 1970s, Benton Ridge wanted to look forward. The old mill was slowing down. Trucks replaced river freight. New contractors came with clean helmets, rolled plans, and confident voices. County officials talked about modernization, efficiency, liability, and progress. They said the floodgate needed a new hydraulic system. They said computer monitoring would make the old manual mechanisms unnecessary. They said sealing the lower chamber would reduce maintenance costs and keep unauthorized workers out. Samuel listened to all of it with the same expression he wore when a machine started making a sound no one else heard yet. Then he asked one question. What happens if the new system locks under pressure? The officials told him the new system was designed not to. Samuel asked again, not because he was against progress. Arthur knew that better than anyone. His father respected good tools, new or old, What he did not respect was a plan that removed the last backup and called itself safer. At a meeting in the mill office, Samuel spread a grease-marked maintenance diagram across a table and pointed to the lower linkage. "Do not seal this chamber," he said. "You can build whatever you want above it, but leave the wheel accessible." A contractor laughed lightly and said, "Mr. Briggs, nobody is going to operate a 1,911 hand wheel in a modern emergency." Samuel looked at him for a long moment. "If your modern emergency has already failed," he said, "you'll wish somebody could." That line followed Arthur for the rest of his life. So did what came after. The chamber was sealed anyway. Not all at once. That was what made it easy for the town to accept. First came a locked access door, then a poured concrete curb, then a revised plan that showed only the new upper assembly, then fewer workers who remembered what had been below, then retirement, layoffs, and silence. Arthur was 24 by then, old enough to understand anger, but not old enough to know what to do with it. Samuel kept writing notes. He kept marking diagrams. He kept telling supervisors that a floodgate without a working manual bypass was not modern. It was incomplete. People started calling him difficult, then stubborn, then unsafe. Arthur remembered the last morning clearly. Rain on the windows, his father buttoning his work coat, a folded memo in his shirt pocket. Samuel paused at the door and told Arthur he was going back down to the lower chamber to document the linkage before the final seal was poured. By sunset, men were saying Samuel Briggs had ignored procedure. By the next week, the official report called it an accident. By the next year, most of Benton Ridge had moved on. Arthur never did. Now, standing in the rain 50 years later, looking at the same mill, Arthur understood that his father had not been afraid of old machines disappearing. He had been afraid of the day when the town would need one and no one would remember where it was. Behind Arthur, the river struck the locked floodgate again. This time, it sounded less like weather. It sounded like Samuel Briggs knocking from the other side of history, asking whether his son was finally ready to answer. Ethan Cole had stopped pretending the problem was simple. For the first hour, he had spoken in the clean language of engineering: pressure imbalance, relay delay, hydraulic resistance, sensor conflict. Those words kept people calm because they made the failure sound contained, as if the right calculation would bring the gate back. But the numbers would not behave. The upper panel showed one reading. The pressure chart showed another. The manual override indicator claimed the release pin had disengaged, yet the floodgate remained locked so hard the steel frame trembled under the river's force. Every few minutes, something heavy struck the other side, and the sound traveled through the concrete like a warning. Ethan wiped rain from his tablet and ran the sequence again. "Nothing. Try the actuator from the secondary box," he said. His assistant looked at him. "We already did. Try it again." The man crossed to the control housing, opened the wet metal panel, and entered the command. A small amber light blinked. Somewhere inside the floodgate structure, a motor hummed for 3 seconds, strained, and died. The crowd heard it fail. Machines did not only break in private. Sometimes they broke in front of everyone who had been told to trust them. Mayor Helen Carver stepped closer. Rain ran from the edge of her yellow hood onto the collar of her navy suit. "Tell me what you need," she said. "Time." "We don't have time." "I know." "No," she said quietly. "If the river jumps the bank before midnight, we lose the nursing home road, the south substation, and half the lower neighborhood." Behind her, volunteers were still filling sandbags, though everyone could see sandbags would not matter much if the gate never opened. A police cruiser rolled down from Mill Road, and the officer shouted that the first lane near River Bend had already flooded. The crowd shifted from nervous to frightened. A woman called her mother's name into a phone. A man yelled that his truck was trapped below the hill. Someone asked why the new system had cost so much if it could not open when the town needed it most. Then Arthur Briggs spoke from near the work lights. "You're fighting the pressure from the wrong side." Ethan turned. Arthur stood in the rain with one hand on his cane, his canvas coat dark at the shoulders. He looked at the concrete base where the modern floodgate met the old river wall. "The upper lock is jammed because the lower linkage is still carrying strain," Arthur said. "You can pull on that panel all night. You'll bend something before you free it." One engineer shook his head. "There is no lower linkage." Arthur looked at him, not angry, almost sad. "You keep saying that like paper built this town." Ethan stepped toward him. "Mr. Briggs, I understand you worked here a long time ago, but the gate was redesigned. The current plans show no active mechanical connection beneath the mill. The current plans start too late. That is not how engineering documentation works. That is exactly how bad history works." The sentence cut through the rain. Even Mayor Carver looked at him. Arthur lifted his cane toward the abandoned mill. Before the hydraulic system, That gate could be opened from below. The wheel chamber sat under the turbine room. A shaft ran through the west wall and into the gate frame. When pressure pinned the upper lock, the wheel gave you leverage from the other end. Ethan wanted to dismiss him. Dismissing an old man was easy when all he carried were memories. But the machine was no longer matching the drawings, and a good engineer could ignore pride only until the equipment forced humility on him. Even if a chamber existed, Ethan said, it would have been disconnected during modernization. Arthur shook his head. They meant to disconnect it. That doesn't mean they did. How would you know? Arthur's eyes moved to the mill doors, black and chained in the rain. Because my father checked before they poured the last wall. Mark Briggs had been listening a few yards away, jaw clenched. He stepped between them. Dad, stop. Arthur did not move. Mark turned to Ethan with an embarrassed look. He's been telling this story for years. It isn't a story, Arthur said. To everyone else, it is. Mark's voice lowered, but it shook with fear. You think standing here arguing about 1,974 is going to save anybody? Arthur looked at his son. Yes. That single word made Mark flinch. Arthur softened his voice. I know what they think I am. Then don't give them more reason. If I walk away because I'm afraid of being laughed at, and those streets flood, what should I call that? Mark had no answer. Another siren wailed from town. Mayor Carver ordered the police chief to expand the evacuation zone. Her words were controlled, but panic sat beneath them. Ethan looked back at the river, then down at his tablet, then at Arthur. For the first time, he did not look amused. He looked cornered. If there was a lower chamber, Ethan said carefully, there should be some reference to it somewhere. A maintenance log. A pre-redesigned record. Something. Arthur nodded. There was. Where? Before Arthur could answer, a woman's voice came from behind the barricade. In the archive basement. Everyone turned. Nora Whitcomb stood in the rain with a plastic document sleeve tucked under her coat. She was Benton Ridge's librarian and the unofficial keeper of everything the town had forgotten but not quite thrown away. I heard Arthur on the emergency channel, she said, so I checked the old maintenance index. Mayor Carver frowned. Nora, this area is restricted. So was the index, apparently. Nora held up the sleeve. Inside was a yellowed card. Briggs Mill Flood Control Service Records, 1911 to 1974. Lower wheel chamber, west linkage inspection, manual river gate bypass. The rain seemed to quiet around those words. Ethan stepped forward and took the sleeve carefully, as if the paper inside might break the whole evening open. Arthur did not smile. He only looked toward the old mill, where the rusted chain across the door hung dark and wet. For 50 years, Benton Ridge had treated that building like a ruin. Now it was beginning to look like the only place left that might still know how to save them. And if Nora's index was right, the next answer was not on Ethan's tablet, not in the crane, and not in the modern control box. It was beneath the mill floor, behind a sealed chamber door no one had opened since the year Arthur's father died. The chain on the old mill door had rusted so badly it looked less like security and more like a warning. Rain struck the brick walls, while Ethan held Nora's old maintenance index in one hand and a flashlight in the other. Mayor Carver had argued that no one should enter. The floors were unstable, the roof was weak, and the county would be responsible if anyone got hurt. But the river was still rising, and the only document that mentioned a manual bypass pointed directly inside Briggs Mill. The police chief cut the chain. The door opened with a wet groan, and the smell of the old building came out into the rain. Oil, mold, river mud, rotting wood. Arthur closed his eyes for half a second. He was 16 again before he could stop himself. Then he stepped inside. Ethan's flashlight moved across broken windows, cobwebs, rusted brackets, and old belt pulleys frozen above them like dark ribs. Dust covered the floor. Leaves had blown in through shattered glass. Water dripped somewhere in the dark. Stay left, Arthur said. Ethan looked down. Why? Right side sits over the old waste channel. Floor's weaker there. Ethan moved left. He did not argue. And Arthur noticed. Nora followed carefully, keeping the plastic sleeve under her coat. 2 firefighters came behind her with portable lights and a pry bar. Mark Briggs entered last, his face tight. Arthur did not look back at him. He was listening to the mill. The old mill had a different silence than an empty house. Empty houses felt abandoned. The mill felt interrupted. Arthur could still hear what was missing. The belt slap, the gear hum, the vibration under his boots, his father's voice saying his name without needing to shout. This way, Arthur said. He led them past the old turbine room. Most of the machinery had been removed decades earlier, but the mounting bolts remained in the floor, circled by rust. The county had sold whatever still had value. What no one wanted had been left to decay. Nora stopped beside a brick column and checked the index card. It says lower wheel chamber access should be behind the west service wall, she said. There's a notation here, WLC. West linkage chamber, Arthur said. That's what my father called it. They found the west wall behind a collapsed stack of wooden crates. One firefighter pulled them aside, and the rotten wood broke apart in his gloves. Behind them, the brick changed color in a straight vertical line. One side was older and darker. The other looked newer, flatter, wrong. Nora raised her flashlight. There. A faded marking remained near shoulder height. Most of the paint had peeled away, but 3 letters were still visible beneath the grime. WLC. No one spoke. It was one thing for Arthur to remember. It was another thing for the wall to remember with him. Ethan stepped closer and ran his fingers along the seam. This was altered. Arthur nodded. After the redesign, no, Ethan said quietly. Someone closed an opening here. Nora looked from the card to the wall. The access door should have been here. It was, Arthur said. He could still see it. A narrow steel door with a round handle that left black grease on a man's glove. Samuel used to open it with his shoulder when damp weather swelled the frame. Arthur had followed him down those steps, proud and afraid at the same time. Now there was only brick, concrete, and silence. A firefighter tapped the lower section with the pry bar. The sound changed halfway down, hollow above, dull below. Concrete behind the bottom, he said. Ethan crouched and shined his light along the base. Poured after the wall was closed. Nora checked the card again. Final seal inspection, October 1974. Arthur felt the date before he understood it. October 1974. The month his father died. Mark saw his face change. Dad? Arthur did not answer. He stepped closer and placed his palm against the newer brick. It was cold and damp, but in his mind, the chamber still existed behind it. The wheel, the shaft, the linkage, the thing Samuel had begged them not to bury. For 50 years, people had called his father stubborn, unsafe, a man who ignored procedure. But this wall said something else. Ethan stood beside Arthur, his voice lower than before. Mr. Briggs, if the chamber is behind here and the linkage is intact, we need access fast. Arthur almost laughed. 50 years was a long time to wait for someone with a clean helmet to finally say they needed what Samuel Briggs had tried to save. We won't get through this wall fast enough, Arthur said. Nora turned the index card over. There may be another way. She pointed to a handwritten line on the back. Lower stair service hatch, turbine room east side. Arthur's breath caught. He had forgotten that hatch. Or maybe he had forced himself to forget it. Samuel had used it when the main access was blocked. It was narrow and steep, but it reached the lower chamber from the side. If it had not been sealed too, they still had a way down. Arthur turned toward the turbine room. Then his flashlight caught a mark low in the mortar beside the closed wall. At first, he thought it was a crack. Then he leaned closer. 3 letters had been scratched deep into the mortar. S.B. Samuel Briggs. Arthur touched the initials with 2 fingers. They were crude, almost hidden, but they had survived. Not a report, not an official record, just a worker's mark left where no one thought to erase it. Mark came up behind him and saw the letters. For once, he said nothing. Outside, the river struck the gate again, and the mill seemed to tremble. Ethan looked from the initials to Arthur. Show me the service hatch. Before Arthur could answer, a voice called from the entrance. Arthur. Mayor Carver stood inside the doorway, rain shining on her yellow coat. Behind her were 2 county officers and the town attorney. The mayor looked past Ethan and Nora, straight at Arthur. This stops now, she said. Arthur stared at her, then at the sealed wall, then at the initials his father had carved before the town buried the chamber. The river was rising. The wheel was somewhere below them. And now the people who had ignored Samuel Briggs were trying to stop his son from opening the place he had died trying to protect. This stops now, Mayor Carver said again. Her voice filled the old mill differently from the rain. It had the practiced firmness of public meetings, budget hearings, emergency briefings, the voice of someone used to being obeyed because order often mattered more than explanation. Arthur did not move. He stood near the sealed wall, with Samuel Briggs's initials still under his fingertips. The letters were small, almost hidden in the mortar. But to Arthur, they felt louder than the sirens outside. Ethan lowered his flashlight. Nora held the maintenance index close to her chest. The 2 firefighters looked from the mayor to Arthur, unsure whose authority mattered more in a building that might decide whether Benton Ridge flooded before midnight. Mayor Carver stepped farther inside. This structure is condemned. No one goes deeper without county approval. Arthur turned slowly. The river isn't waiting on county approval. That is not your decision to make. No, Arthur said. It became my decision when everyone else decided the only door worth opening was the wrong one. The town attorney, a thin man with wet glasses, cleared his throat. Mr. Briggs, if you continue interfering with emergency operations, the county can hold you responsible for any injury, damage, or delay caused by unauthorized entry. Mark Briggs moved immediately. That's enough, he said, but he was not speaking to the attorney. He was speaking to his father. Arthur looked at him. Mark's face was tight with embarrassment, fear, and something that looked almost like anger because it had nowhere else to go. Dad, listen to them, Mark said. Please. Arthur's voice softened. You saw the initials. I saw scratches in a wall. You know what they were. What I know is that you're standing in a condemned mill during a flood, arguing with the mayor, the county attorney, and the people trying to save the town. Arthur said nothing. Mark stepped closer, lowering his voice, but everyone could still hear him. Do you understand what this does to me? To my company? I bid on county jobs. I work with these people. I have crews depending on me. I have a wife, kids, payroll, insurance. You think this is just about being brave, but when this is over, I'm the one who has to live here with whatever mess you make. The words hit harder because they were honest. Arthur had expected shame from strangers. He had learned to live with that. But shame from a son carried a different weight. It entered places age had not hardened yet. For a moment, he saw Mark at 8 years old, sitting on the kitchen floor with a toy crane, asking why Grandpa Samuel's picture stayed in the hallway if nobody talked about him. Arthur had not known how to answer then. Maybe he still did not. I'm not trying to ruin your name, Arthur said. Mark laughed once, bitter and short. You don't have to try. Nora looked away. Ethan pretended to study the wall. Outside, another siren wailed down the hill. Mayor Carver used the silence. Arthur, we are expanding the evacuation zone. That is the responsible choice now. If people are inside this building when it shifts, or if you damage something connected to the gate, you could make things worse. Arthur looked at her. Worse than losing the lower streets? Worse than sending untrained people into an unstable chamber based on a 50-year-old memory. It isn't just memory. It is not enough. That sentence changed the air between them. Arthur stared at the mayor, and for the first time, his face showed anger cleanly. That's what they said to my father. Mayor Carver went still. Arthur took one step toward her. Not threatening, just unwilling to let the words remain buried. He had diagrams, notes, maintenance records. He knew that wheel chamber mattered. He told them sealing it was dangerous, and when he died, the report said he ignored procedure. The mayor's expression tightened. I was not mayor in 1974. No, Arthur said. But your father sat on the county board that signed the redesign. Mark closed his eyes. Dad. Arthur did not stop. For 50 years, this town called Samuel Briggs stubborn because it was easier than asking why a stubborn man was right. They buried the chamber. They buried the wheel. Then they buried him under a line in a report that made him look careless. The mayor's voice dropped. This is not the moment for old accusations. Arthur looked toward the door, where rain and emergency lights flashed against the brick. When the water is at people's porches, that is exactly when old mistakes come due. No one answered. Outside the mill, the crowd had grown louder. Word had spread that Arthur's story might have proof. Some people shouted for the mayor to let him try. Others yelled that an old man had no business risking lives over a family grudge. Fear divided people quickly. It made every opinion sound like survival. A volunteer appeared at the doorway. Mayor, River Bend is flooding faster than expected. Carver turned sharply. How fast? Fast enough that we're moving the nursing home buses now. That broke something in the room. Ethan looked at the sealed wall, then toward the turbine room where the service hatch might still exist. Mayor, if the bypass is real, we may need it. The attorney started to object, but Ethan spoke over him. I'm not saying he's right about everything. I'm saying the current system is not responding. The old index confirms a manual bypass, and the physical wall confirms a sealed access. From an engineering standpoint, ignoring that is no longer rational. Arthur watched Mayor Carver absorb those words. They did not make her agree. They made it harder for her to refuse. Mark turned to his father again, quieter now. And if you're wrong? Arthur looked at his son. There were many things he could have said. That he was not wrong. That Samuel had not been wrong. That a man knew the shape of a place that had made him. But none of those would reach Mark yet. So Arthur told the truth. If I'm wrong, I'll carry it. Mark's face shifted. Arthur looked back toward the turbine room. But if I stop because I'm afraid of being laughed at, and people lose their homes tonight, I'll carry that too. Mayor Carver said. Arthur. He cut her off, not loudly. I let them bury my father once. I won't help them bury him again. Then he picked up his cane and walked toward the turbine room. For a second, no one followed. Then Ethan did. Nora followed after him, clutching the index like a map out of a grave. Mark stayed behind, breathing hard, staring at the initials in the wall. Outside, the river struck the gate again, and the old mill answered with a low tremble. Finally, Mark turned. He did not apologize. He did not say he believed. But he followed his father into the dark. The turbine room waited in the east side of the mill, like a part of the building that had never expected visitors again. The old machines were gone, but their absence had weight. Rusted bolts still rose from the floor where turbines had once stood. Dark stains marked the concrete in wide circles. Rainwater dripped through the damaged roof and gathered in shallow puddles that reflected the flashlights. Arthur stopped near the far wall. "There," he said. At first, Ethan saw nothing but cracked concrete and a pile of broken boards. Then Nora lifted her flashlight lower, and the outline appeared. A square metal hatch set into the floor, almost hidden beneath dirt, leaves, and a strip of collapsed shelving. Mark stepped forward and kicked the boards aside. The hatch was smaller than he expected. "That's it?" he asked. Arthur nodded. "Service access, not built for comfort." One firefighter knelt and cleared mud from the edge with a gloved hand. The metal ring was rusted flat against the plate. He hooked it with the pry bar and pulled. Nothing happened. Ethan checked his watch, then looked toward the door, where the storm flashed white across the windows. "We need it open." The firefighter braced himself and pulled again. This time the hatch gave a short, ugly scream, metal tearing loose from years of stillness. Cold air rose from below, damp and mineral-heavy, carrying the smell of river stone, old grease, and something Arthur had not allowed himself to remember. Samuel's coat after a shift. Arthur gripped his cane harder. "You don't have to go first," Mark said. Arthur looked at him, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "Yes," Arthur said, "I do." The ladder below was narrow, bolted into the wall, slick with condensation. Arthur lowered himself slowly, 1 foot at a time. His bad knee protested by the 3rd rung. By the 6th, the sound of the storm above began to fade, replaced by the deeper sound of water moving somewhere behind stone. Ethan came after him, then Nora, then Mark. The chamber below was low-ceilinged and colder than the mill. Their flashlights swept across brick arches, pipe brackets, rusted rods, and old iron supports. Water seeped through a seam in the far wall and ran in thin lines across the floor. Every sound echoed twice before disappearing into the dark. Arthur stood still. For a moment, he was not 76. He was 24, hearing men shout his father's name. He was 16, following Samuel down the same damp passage. He was a boy pretending not to be afraid, because his father never seemed afraid of anything that could be understood. "Dad?" Mark said. Arthur blinked. "I'm all right," but he was not sure he was. Nora checked the index card again. "The wheel should be on the west wall, near the main linkage shaft." Arthur raised his flashlight. There. The beam found it slowly, as if uncovering a buried face. A black iron wheel stood against the brick wall, shoulder high, its spokes thick and uneven under layers of dust. Rust had gathered along the rim. A faded metal plate above it still held 4 numbers. E. No one spoke. Even Mark, who had heard the story all his life, seemed unable to look away. The wheel was real. Not memory. Not stubbornness. Not an old man's embarrassment in public. Real. Arthur stepped toward it. His boots splashed through a shallow sheet of water. He reached out, then stopped just short of touching the iron. The last time he had stood this close, Samuel Briggs had been alive. Ethan moved his light along the mechanism. The wheel connected to a thick shaft that disappeared through the west wall. Beside it, a gear housing sat half hidden under grime. He crouched, wiped dirt from a coupling, and stared. "This wasn't fully disconnected," he said. Nora looked at him. "Meaning?" "Meaning Mr. Briggs may be right. The linkage still enters the gate frame." Mark exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for years. Arthur finally placed both hands on the wheel. The iron was cold. For a second, he heard Samuel again. "Feel the wheel before you force it, son." Arthur leaned gently. Nothing moved. He shifted his grip and tried again. The wheel did not turn. Ethan stepped beside him. "Could be seized." "Could be," Arthur said. Mark came forward. "Let me help." Arthur almost said no. Then he moved one hand aside. Father and son gripped the same iron rim. They pushed. The wheel held. Mark pushed harder. "Easy," Arthur said. "It's stuck. You force old iron. It breaks before it speaks." Mark let go, frustrated. "Then what do we do?" Arthur lowered his flashlight along the hub, searching not with panic but with memory. The surface was filthy, but the shape beneath it was familiar. Rim. Spoke, hub, grease cup, stop bracket. Then he saw it. A narrow locking pin sat behind the lower spoke, nearly hidden under rust and dirt. It had been driven into place from the side, not part of the wheel itself but part of the safety lock Samuel had once shown him. Arthur crouched slowly. "There's your answer," he said. Ethan knelt beside him. "A locking pin? Old safety hold. Keeps the wheel from drifting when pressure shifts. Can we remove it?" Arthur wiped grime from the pin with his thumb. Something small moved under the dirt, a metal tag tied with brittle wire. He cleaned it carefully. The letters appeared one by one. S. Briggs. For a long moment, Arthur could not breathe. Mark saw the tag and went pale. Nora whispered, "Samuel." Arthur held the tag between his fingers like it weighed more than iron. His father had not only been in this chamber, he had marked the very lock that kept the wheel from turning. And if Samuel had left his name here, then maybe he had left something else behind too, something that could finally prove what he had tried to warn them about before the town chose silence. Above them, faint but urgent, another siren wailed through the storm. Ethan looked from the tag to the wheel. "Arthur," he said, "we need to know what your father knew." Arthur closed his hand around the tag. Then he looked deeper into the chamber, where old pipes vanished into darkness and 50 years of buried truth waited beyond the reach of the light. Arthur held the small metal tag in his palm while the chamber seemed to breathe around him. S. Briggs. The letters were stamped unevenly, worn by rust and time, but they were clear enough. His father's name had survived where the official report had not. It had survived water, concrete, silence, and 50 years of people calling Samuel Briggs careless. Nora crouched near a rusted storage cabinet built into the chamber wall. Its door had swollen shut, but one corner was bent outward, as if someone had tried to open it long ago and failed. "There may be records down here," she said. Ethan looked up from the locking pin. "Maintenance notes? Maybe. Mills kept paper everywhere." Mark took the pry bar from the firefighter and wedged it into the cabinet seam. He pulled once. Nothing. He pulled again, harder, and the door snapped open with a metallic cry that echoed through the chamber. Inside were ruined gloves, a cracked oil can, and a stack of papers wrapped in brittle wax cloth. Nora lifted the bundle with both hands. "Careful," Arthur said. His own voice surprised him. It sounded like a man speaking near a grave. The first pages were old inspection sheets, stained but readable. Dates, signatures, pressure tests, grease schedules, wheel checks. Then Nora found a folded copy of an incident report dated the 18th of October 1974. Samuel Briggs' fatal injury during unauthorized entry into lower wheel chamber. Arthur closed his eyes. He had read those words before. They had followed him through every funeral handshake, every whispered conversation, every look from people who thought a stubborn worker had finally paid for being stubborn. Ethan took the report and read quickly. His flashlight moved down the page. "This says Samuel entered after the chamber was closed." "He entered before it was finished," Arthur said. Ethan frowned. "It says the linkage had already been disconnected." Arthur looked at the wheel. "Then why is it still here?" No one answered. Ethan moved to the gear housing and studied the shaft, the pin, the old coupling. He checked the report again. "This doesn't match the mechanism," he said. "If the linkage had been disconnected, pressure from the gate couldn't have loaded this pin. But it did. You can see the wear pattern." Nora found another sheet in the bundle. "There's a memo." Arthur did not reach for it right away. He knew before he saw the handwriting. Samuel's words always leaned slightly forward, as if even ink had somewhere to go. Nora read softly. "To County Flood Board and Redesign Committee. Do not seal the manual wheel chamber. Upper hydraulic failure under river pressure may require lower release access. Removing or blocking this system eliminates final emergency control." The chamber went still. Arthur's hand closed around the tag until its edge bit his skin. Mark stared at the memo. "He wrote that?" Arthur nodded. "More than once." Nora turned the page. "There are notes in the margin. Meeting denied. No budget revision. Proceed with seal." Ethan's face hardened. "Who signed it?" Nora hesitated. Mayor Carver had come halfway down the ladder with an officer behind her. She stood on the lower rungs, listening. The chamber light caught her face just as Nora read the name. Robert Carver, County Board Chair. The mayor's father. No one said it out loud because no one had to. Mayor Carver stepped off the ladder slowly. "My father believed the redesign was safe." Arthur looked at her. "My father believed it wasn't. That doesn't mean anyone meant harm." "No," Arthur said. "It means they chose not to listen." For the first time that night, the mayor had no prepared answer. Arthur looked back at the report, and the old memory rose whole. He was 24 again, standing outside the mill in rain that looked too much like tonight's. Men moved fast around him but would not meet his eyes. Someone kept saying there had been an accident. Someone else said Samuel had gone where he should not have gone. Then they brought out his father's hard hat. Not his body at first, just the hard hat. There was a dent across the side and a smear of grease on the brim. Arthur remembered touching it with both hands. He remembered asking what happened. He remembered a supervisor saying, "Your father ignored procedure." Arthur had believed anger would come first. Instead, shame came. That was the cruelty of the report. It did not only blame Samuel. It taught his son to lower his voice when speaking his name. Mark's voice broke the silence. "Why didn't you tell me all this?" Arthur looked at him. "I tried." "No," Mark said, then stopped. His face changed as the truth found him. "Maybe you did." He looked at the wheel, the tag, the memo, the report. All the pieces he had dismissed for years as old grief, old bitterness, old stories. "I thought you couldn't let it go," Mark said. Arthur's eyes softened. "I couldn't. But not because I wanted to live in it." Mark swallowed hard. "Because nobody believed him." Arthur nodded. A radio crackled from the officer's belt above them. The sound was broken by static, but the message came through. "Water level at emergency mark. Repeat, emergency mark. Lower evacuation incomplete." Ethan snapped back to the present. He took the memo from Nora and held it beside the mechanism. "This warning is exactly what we're seeing now," he said. "Upper hydraulic failure under river pressure. Lower release required." The mayor looked from the memo to the wheel. Her father's signature sat at the bottom of a decision that had outlived him and now threatened the town she governed. "What do you need?" she asked. Ethan answered before Arthur could. "We remove the locking pin. Then Arthur shows us how to turn the wheel without shearing the old shaft." The officer shifted nervously. "And if the wheel breaks?" Arthur looked at Samuel's memo one last time. "Then Benton Ridge loses the last chance my father tried to leave it." Another siren rose above them, thin and urgent through the mill floor. Arthur placed the tag in Mark's hand. "Hold on to that," he said. Mark looked down at his grandfather's name. This time, he did not look ashamed. He looked responsible. Arthur turned back to the wheel. The truth had opened. Now the gate had to. The radio kept crackling above them. Emergency mark reached. Lower evacuation incomplete. South Road partially flooded. Each message came broken by static, but the meaning was clear enough. Benton Ridge was running out of minutes, not hours. Arthur stood before the 1911 wheel with both hands hanging at his sides. The old iron waited in the flashlight beams, black with age, cold with river damp, stubborn as memory itself. The locking pin sat behind the lower spoke, rusted deep into its bracket. Ethan crouched beside it. "If we snap the pin wrong, could it jam the wheel permanently?" "Yes," Arthur said. Mark looked at him. "And if we don't remove it, then nothing moves." The chamber fell quiet except for water ticking down the brick and the low, distant pressure of the river against the gate. Arthur reached for the pry bar, then stopped. "No," he said, "not that." Ethan frowned. "Why?" "Too much force at the wrong angle." Arthur pointed to the rusted bracket. "That pin wasn't built to be attacked. It was built to be eased out." Mark almost smiled despite the fear. "You're talking to it like it's alive." Arthur looked at the wheel. "Old machines are like old men. If nobody listens, they make you pay for it." For the first time that night, Mark did not roll his eyes. Arthur asked for a hammer, a short wrench, and oil. One firefighter passed them down. Ethan held the flashlight steady while Arthur cleaned the edge of the pin with a rag. His hands shook, but not from fear. They shook from age, cold, and the terrible pressure of knowing that 50 years of memory had come down to one rusted piece of iron. "Mark," Arthur said. His son stepped closer. "Hold the wheel. Don't turn it. Just take the weight." Mark placed both hands on the rim. Arthur tapped the side of the pin once. Nothing. He tapped again. Lighter. Still nothing. Ethan glanced at the radio. Arthur did not look away from the pin. "Again?" Mark asked. Arthur shook his head. "Now we wait." "For what?" "To see if it answered." A thin line of dark oil crept along the edge of the bracket. Arthur wiped it with his thumb, shifted the wrench half an inch, and tapped once more. This time, the pin moved. Not much. Less than the width of a coin. But everyone saw it. Mark's grip tightened. It moved. "Easy," Arthur said. They worked slowly. Tap. Wait. Turn the wrench. Tap again. Each small movement felt too slow for the sirens above them, too careful for a town flooding in the dark. But Arthur knew the truth of old iron. Hurry could waste more time than patience. At last, the pin slid free with a wet metallic scrape. The wheel shifted under Mark's hands. He gasped. "Dad, I've got it," Arthur said, though he did not. Not alone. He placed both hands beside Mark's on the rim. For 1 second, father and son stood shoulder to shoulder in the chamber where Samuel Briggs had left his name. Above them, A town that had laughed at Arthur waited for the result of a machine it had forgotten. Below them, the river pressed hard against steel. Arthur leaned. Mark leaned with him. The wheel did not turn. Mark pushed harder. "No," Arthur said sharply. "Not like that. We have to move it. We have to move it right." Ethan stepped to the side, tablet in one hand, flashlight tucked under his arm. "Pressure is still climbing. If the linkage engages, I should see a change in the upper lock reading." Arthur nodded without taking his eyes off the wheel. "Tell me when it breathes." "When it what?" "You'll know." Arthur shifted his feet, bad knee trembling. He closed his eyes for half a second and let his palms feel the wheel. Not the rust. Not the cold. The tension inside it. "Feel before you force it, son." He leaned again. Not forward this time, but down and across, following the old gear's arc. The wheel gave a low groan. Mark froze. "Keep with me," Arthur said. They leaned together. The groan deepened. Somewhere inside the west wall, a shaft answered with a dull knock. Then another. Ethan looked at his tablet. "Wait," he said. "I'm seeing movement in the lower pressure reading." Arthur's face tightened. "How much?" "Small, but real." "Then we keep going." The wheel turned an inch. Then two. The chamber seemed to wake around them. Rust cracked. Water trembled in the floor seams. The old linkage knocked behind the brick like a heart remembering its rhythm after decades of silence. Mark's face twisted with effort. "I can feel it." Arthur breathed through the pain in his knee. "Don't fight it. Follow it." They pushed again. Above them, a shout came through the open hatch. The gate moved. Ethan looked up. "How much?" "Not enough." Arthur bared his teeth and leaned harder. This time Mark moved with him before being told. The wheel turned a quarter rotation. Then the whole chamber shook. A deep metallic boom rolled through the wall. So powerful Nora cried out and grabbed the ladder. For one terrible second, Arthur thought something had broken. Then the sound changed. It became a roar. Not inside the chamber. Outside. The floodgate was opening. Ethan ran to the ladder and shouted upward, "Confirm movement." The radio burst alive. "Gate is opening." "Repeat, gate is opening." Another voice came through, nearly drowned by rain and static. "Water is releasing. River level is dropping at the gate." No one cheered at first. They were too stunned. Then Mark let go of the wheel and looked at his father as if seeing him clearly for the first time in years. Arthur kept one hand on the iron rim. He was breathing hard. His knee burned. His shoulders ached. But his eyes were not on the wheel. They were on the tag in Mark's hand. S. Briggs. Above them, Benton Ridge began to understand that it had been saved by a system it had buried and a warning it had ignored. Mayor Carver climbed down into the chamber slowly. Her face had changed. Not softened exactly. Stripped. The look of someone who had just realized survival did not erase responsibility. Ethan held up Samuel's memo. "This has to go into the record," he said. The mayor did not answer. Arthur looked at her. For decades, the town had accepted the easy version. Samuel Briggs made a mistake. Samuel Briggs ignored procedure. Samuel Briggs died because he was stubborn. But the wheel had turned. The gate had opened. And now the truth had moved too far to be pushed back into the wall. Arthur released the rim and straightened as much as his body allowed. "They'll want a hero by morning," he said quietly. Mark looked at him. "You are one." Arthur shook his head. "No. First they give my father his name back." Above them, the sirens began to fade, replaced by the distant roar of water finally moving where it should have moved all along. But Arthur knew the hardest part was not opening the gate. The hardest part would be making Benton Ridge admit why it had stayed closed. By the time Arthur climbed back out of the lower chamber, Benton Ridge was no longer screaming. It was listening. The floodgate had opened enough to release the pressure against the river wall. Water still rushed hard through the channel, but it was moving now, roaring away from the lower streets instead of climbing toward them. Emergency crews kept working. Families were still being moved. Roads were still flooded in places. But the town was no longer waiting to drown. Outside the old mill, people stood in the rain and stared at Arthur as he stepped through the doorway. Some had laughed at him less than 2 hours earlier. Some had called him confused. Some had looked away when Mark tried to pull him back from embarrassment. Now they did not know where to put their eyes. A woman near the barricade began clapping, then another, then several more. The applause spread unevenly through the crowd, uncertain at first, then louder, as relief searched for somewhere to go. A volunteer shouted, "Arthur opened it." Someone else yelled, "He saved River Bend." Mark stood behind his father, still holding the small metal tag stamped S. Briggs. He looked at the crowd, then at Arthur, and for once he seemed less worried about what people thought of the Briggs name. Mayor Carver came out of the mill with Ethan and Nora behind her. Her raincoat was streaked with mud now. The polished public version of her had been washed down to something more human and much more afraid. The police chief approached her. "Mayor, local news is asking for a statement." She looked at Arthur. Then she looked at the crowd. "We'll make one," she said. A small space cleared near the emergency vehicles. Someone brought over a portable work light. Cameras rose. Phones pointed. The mayor stood in front of the old mill with the river still roaring behind her. Arthur knew what was coming before she spoke. "Tonight," Mayor Carver began, "Benton Ridge was protected because of the courage and knowledge of Arthur Briggs. His quick thinking helped emergency crews access an old manual system that assisted in opening the floodgate." People nodded. Cameras stayed on Arthur. The words were clean. Too clean. Arthur looked at Ethan. Ethan looked down. The mayor continued. "There will be time later to review infrastructure records and determine what improvements need to be made. Right now, our priority is safety, evacuation support, and moving forward together as a town." Moving forward. Arthur had heard that phrase before. It was what people said when they wanted the benefits of truth without the cost of confession. He stepped forward. Mark caught his arm, not to stop him this time, but to steady him. Arthur looked at his son's hand, then at the mayor. "With respect," Arthur said, "that statement is not enough." The crowd quieted. Mayor Carver's face tightened. "Arthur, this may not be the best time. It's the first honest time this town has had in 50 years. No one moved." Arthur turned toward the people behind the barricade. Rain ran down his face, but he did not wipe it away. "My father's name was Samuel Briggs. Most of you never met him. Some of your parents did. Some of them heard he died because he ignored procedure. Some of them repeated it until it sounded like fact." The mayor glanced toward the cameras. Arthur kept going. "My father warned the county not to seal that manual wheel chamber. He wrote it down. He explained that if the upper hydraulic system failed under river pressure, the town would need lower release access. He was ignored. Then when he died in that chamber, the report blamed him." Nora stepped forward and lifted the wrapped papers. "We found the memo," she said, "and the incident report." Ethan moved beside her. His voice was steady, but not proud. "As the engineer responsible on site tonight, I can confirm that Mr. Samuel Briggs's warning described the failure pattern we saw. The manual bypass existed. The linkage remained active. The current plans did not include it." A murmur moved through the crowd. Mayor Carver closed her eyes for one brief second. Arthur looked at her. "Your father signed the order to proceed with the seal." People turned. The mayor opened her eyes. "My father was county board chair," she said slowly, "and his signature is on the record." That admission landed heavier than any applause. She swallowed. "I cannot speak for the choices made in 1974. But I can say this. The town will open a formal review of the redesign, the incident report, and Samuel Briggs's warning. If the record is wrong, it will be corrected." Arthur did not answer immediately. He had imagined this moment for years, but imagination had always made it feel louder. In real life, it was quieter, wetter, colder, more painful. Then Mark stepped beside him. "There's something else," Mark said. Arthur turned, surprised. Mark faced the crowd. His voice shook, but he did not look away. "I spent years thinking my father was holding on to an old grievance. I thought he was embarrassing himself. Tonight, I learned he was carrying something the rest of us refused to carry with him." His fingers closed around Samuel's tag. "I'm sorry, Dad." Arthur looked at him. Those 3 words did not fix 50 years. They did not bring Samuel back. They did not erase the times Arthur had lowered his voice when speaking of his father. But they opened a door that had been sealed almost as long as the chamber. Arthur placed one hand on Mark's shoulder. "That's enough for tonight," he said quietly. But Mark shook his head. "No, it isn't." He turned to the mayor. "Put Samuel Briggs's name back where it belongs, not as a careless worker, as the man who warned this town." The crowd was silent. Then an older man near the back removed his cap. "My dad worked that mill," he said. "He always said Samuel Briggs knew more about that gate than anyone." Another voice followed. "My mother said the report never sounded right." Then another. "Open the records." The word spread. "Open the records." Mayor Carver looked at the old mill behind Arthur, then at the floodgate still releasing water into the dark. She seemed to understand that the town had survived the river, but it would not survive the lie untouched. She nodded once. "The records will be opened," she said, "publicly." Arthur looked back at the mill door. For the first time since 1974, he did not feel as if his father had been left alone inside. The gate was open. The chamber was open. And now, finally, so was the story Benton Ridge had buried with Samuel Briggs. 3 days after the flood, Benton Ridge gathered outside the old mill again. This time, no one stood behind barricades laughing. The river had fallen back into its banks, leaving mud on porches, grass bent flat, and brown water lines across garage doors on the lower streets. The town was not untouched. A few basements were ruined. Mill Road still smelled of river silt. Volunteers were still carrying wet furniture out of houses and stacking ruined carpet beside the curb. But Benton Ridge was standing. That alone made people quieter. The old mill stood beside the river in the pale morning light, its broken windows still dark, its bricks still cracked, its roof still sagging. Nothing about it had suddenly become beautiful, yet people looked at it differently now. Not like an eyesore, not like wasted riverfront, not like a building waiting to be torn down. They looked at it like a witness. A small platform had been set near the entrance. Mayor Helen Carver stood beside it without the polished confidence she usually carried. Her yellow raincoat was gone. She wore a plain dark coat, and in her hands was a folder of copied records. Samuel Briggs's memo, the incident report, the maintenance index, and the first page of the county's formal correction. Arthur stood near the back. He had not wanted the platform. He had not wanted a speech. He had especially not wanted the word hero used again. Mark stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, but not so close it looked forced. That was how repair often began between men like them. Not with dramatic embraces, not with speeches, just by standing near what they had both been afraid to face. Mayor Carver stepped to the microphone. Benton Ridge owes its safety this week to many people, she said. Emergency crews, volunteers, engineers, neighbors, and families who helped one another under pressure. She paused. And we owe something else to a man this town failed to hear 50 years ago. No one moved. The mayor opened the folder. Samuel Briggs warned the county in 1974 that sealing the lower wheel chamber would remove the final emergency control for the floodgate. His warning was dismissed. After his death, the official report described him as a worker who ignored procedure. Based on the records found inside Briggs' mill, that description was incomplete and unjust. Arthur lowered his eyes. For most of his life, he had imagined anger carrying him through this moment. Instead, it was grief. Quiet grief. The kind that did not burn anymore but still had weight. Mayor Carver turned slightly toward him. Today, Benton Ridge formally restores Samuel Briggs's name in the record. Not as a careless worker, not as a stubborn man who refused progress, but as the man who tried to leave this town one last way out. The cover came off the plaque. It was simple bronze, fixed to a temporary stand until the mill wall could be reinforced. In memory of Samuel Briggs, mill worker and flood safety keeper, whose warning saved Benton Ridge long after it was ignored. With gratitude to Arthur Briggs, who remembered. Arthur read it once. Then again. His father's name came first. That mattered more than he could explain. Applause rose, but it was softer than the applause after the gate opened. This was not relief looking for somewhere to go. This was respect, and respect had a different sound. Mark looked at the plaque for a long time. I should have asked you, he said. Arthur kept his eyes forward. Asked me what? Why you never let it go. Arthur breathed in slowly. The air still smelled faintly of mud and old rain. I don't know if I would have answered right. Mark nodded. Maybe, but I still should have asked. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Mark reached into his coat pocket and took out the small tag stamped S. Briggs. He had cleaned it carefully. The letters were still worn, but now they were clear. Nora said it should go in the archive, Mark said. Unless you want to keep it. Arthur looked at the tag in his son's palm. There was a time he would have kept it hidden in a drawer, taking it out only when memory hurt too much to ignore. But that was the old way. The lonely way. No, Arthur said, let them keep it where people can see it. Mark closed his hand around it, then nodded. Near the platform, Ethan Cole was speaking with 2 county engineers and a flood safety inspector. He had spread new diagrams across the hood of a truck, but this time the old system was drawn in red beside the modern one. The wheel stays accessible, Ethan said, not ceremonial. Functional. We build a protected entry, reinforce the chamber, document the linkage, and train crews on the manual sequence. One of the engineers asked, You really think we'll ever need a 1911 wheel again? Ethan looked toward Arthur. I think Benton Ridge already answered that. Inside the mill, Nora Whitcomb had set up a folding table with archival boxes, gloves, and labels. She worked carefully, placing Samuel's memo into a protective sleeve, then the corrected report, then the maintenance index. The tag would go with them, not buried, not rumored, not dependent on one old man's memory. Recorded. That was a kind of mercy, too. Later, after the crowd thinned and the news vans left, Arthur walked into the mill with Mark, Ethan, Nora, and a small group of local students whose teacher had brought them to witness the dedication. The temporary lights were still strung along the turbine room. The service hatch had been secured with a new railing. Down below, the chamber waited, no longer secret. Arthur moved slowly to the 1911 wheel. One boy looked at it and asked, "Does it still work?" Arthur smiled faintly. It worked when it had to. He placed both hands on the rim, not to open the gate this time, only to show them how a man listened before he forced anything. Mark stood beside him, close enough to help if Arthur's knee failed, but he did not reach too soon. Arthur turned the wheel just an inch. The old iron gave a low, steady sound. 3 days earlier, that sound had been buried beneath concrete, pride, and silence. Now it echoed through the chamber while children listened. Arthur looked at the wheel, then at the students, then at Mark. For the first time in 50 years, Briggs Mill did not feel like the place where he had lost his father. It felt like the place where Benton Ridge had finally found him.